Well, good evening. It's good to see all of you here today. I hope you've had a great weekend so far. And as you transition back to work and to school tomorrow, I pray that that transition goes well for you. For those of you that are normally here on Sunday nights at Landmark, you might notice a heavy teenage presence on this side of the room. And that, of course, as Ken said, is because we'll be hosting the area-wide, the combined Roundhouse devotional tonight. We're going to have it immediately after our services out in the gym. It's just a time for our kids to be able to get together throughout the school year, once a month, and just to continue that fellowship that they had throughout the summer during our Summer Youth Series. And for those of you that are not normally here in Landmark on Sunday nights, this half of the room looks a little bit like there's not very many people because a lot of our ladies are in a ladies' Bible class right across the hall. So we have a very mixed bag today, a mixed audience, and so I'm excited about the fact that you guys are here. I hope you are uplifted and encouraged by tonight's message. If you have your Bibles with you, be turning to the book of Habakkuk. Yeah, I said Habakkuk. We're going to go to Habakkuk and try to learn some things there. How many of you had no idea there was a book of the Bible called Habakkuk? Okay, all right, we're doing good so far. I'll admit to you, growing up, and I went to a private school, I went to church growing up, and the only reason that I knew that there was a book of the Bible called Habakkuk is because of the funky name that the book bears. I was like, that's a cool name, and so it always stuck out in my mind, there's a book of the Bible called Habakkuk. But I had no idea what it said, no idea what it meant, no idea what kind of lessons I could apply to my own life from that book. But we're going to study a little bit of that book today. We're going to give just kind of an overview, and hopefully we can learn some things that we can apply to our lives to make us better people, members of our family and communities and churches and school. But before we get into the text, I want to ask you guys a question. And for those of you that aren't normally here on Sunday nights, our Sunday nights generally have a little bit of participation, so don't be afraid to talk. You can answer questions and you can interact with me. So who here... And I'm kind of focusing this question on this half of the room because this half of the room, you guys might not remember when this happened in your life. But who all has ever had braces before? Braces? Anybody had braces before? Okay. When I was growing up in my junior high and high school career, I actually had braces on 2 different occasions, probably because I didn't wear my retainer well enough after the first go-around. But let's all admit, wearing braces for a couple of years is not the most fun thing in the world, right? Can you guys relate to that? It's actually quite miserable for the most part. And so I want to ask you, what are some of the worst things that you've been able to notice from your experience about having braces? Yeah, it was only miserable for me? Anybody? Oh, I hated that. Every once in a while, a wire would pop out and it'd cut your cheek or your gum. Anybody else? What? Power chain. Ugh. That orthodontist would crank down on that thing for you. Yes, ma'am. Oh, yeah. Yeah, you got to be careful about what you eat. You don't want to break your braces. Yes, ma'am. It does hurt. Does hurt. Anybody else? Garrett, you got anything? Oh, okay. I saw another hand. Deacon. Oh, yeah, that was the worst. They give you a special little tool that you can poke up in there and get all that food out of there, right? Braces are miserable. I considered it as a teenager to be like a form of torture, right? If you're going to put this hardware in a teenager's mouth, you're basically torturing them the entire time that they have it. What about this one? Sometimes you might feel, when you're wearing braces, a little goofy looking, right? Y'all ever thought about that? Maybe that was just me. I felt goofy looking. I was also playing in the band about the time that I got braces. I was playing the trumpet. And so when I started to play, right after I got them, I was terrible. I couldn't do it. I couldn't get my lips in the right. Yeah, some of you have had that experience as well. But what does the orthodontist tell you every time you go in there complaining about how much it hurts, how much you want him to take them off? All the misery you're going through, the orthodontist will always tell you the same thing. It's worth it. Trust me, I know what I'm doing. I spent almost a decade in medical school to be able to fix your teeth. And I promise, if you will just wait and watch my plan work, even though it's painful, even though it's miserable, in the end, it's going to be worth it. I'm going to use that pain and that misery to create something beautiful. And many of you who have had braces, you see the transition your teeth makes, and your smile is just that much more beautiful when you get on the other end of it. Well, our boy Habakkuk here found himself in a very similar situation. Not necessarily having hardware in his mouth and going to the orthodontist every other month to get his braces cranked. But Habakkuk lived during the final days of Israel's southern kingdom. And it was at a time of extreme injustice and idolatry. And this sinfulness surrounding Habakkuk caused him to question God's lack of judgment. It was painful. It was miserable. It was embarrassing for Habakkuk to watch this going on in the southern kingdom of Judah. And like Job, Habakkuk asks the question, why? God, why are you allowing this to happen? This is contrary to everything you've ever taught us. We are doing things that fly directly in your face. Why are you allowing this to continue? And God answers his complaints with a couple of proofs and predictions. And by the end of the conversation, in this short 3-chapter book, Habakkuk catches a glimpse of God's character, and he can only stand back in awe, as I think we can all imagine we would do at a time like that. But I want to go through this here because I tell my teenagers all the time it's very important if you go to study a passage of Scripture or a book, especially one as obscure as the minor prophet Habakkuk, it's important you understand the context. The who, the what, the when, the where, the why. What is going on in the culture? Who wrote the book? Who were they writing to? What was going on socially, economically, spiritually? What was happening to make Habakkuk write his short book? And I've got a timeline that I like to use that I put up here. And this is a timeline of Israelite history. And some of the dates are circa, which means about. But about 1446 BC, the Israelites are rescued out of the hands of captivity by Moses. They leave Egypt, they cross the Red Sea and enter into the wilderness. And because of some of the bad decisions that they made, everybody who was 20 and older was not allowed to immediately enter the Promised Land. And they wander around for about 40 years, and finally, Joshua, who succeeds Moses, is able to take them into the Promised Land. And they set up camp in their various areas, all the 12 tribes of Israel. They're given their land allotments. And everything is peaceful for a while. But then Israel falls back into sin. They start making bad decisions, doing things that they know they should not do, completely contrary to God's law. And it starts this cycle of the judges, where Israel does great, but then they sin. God sends a wicked nation to oppress them. They cry out to God for help. God sends them help in the form of a judge. The judge leads them in usually a military victory, and then the cycle starts all over again. And it goes around and around and around several times over. And then in 1051, or shortly there before, the nation of Israel begins to cry out to God, God, everybody around us has a king to lead them. Why can't we have a king? It's the popular thing to do. That's what we want. We no longer want judges to lead us. And God says, there are problems that come when you allow men to be the king of your people and not God. But, he says, I might be able to use this to teach you a lesson. So, the last judge, first prophet, kind of depending on who you study there, by the name of Samuel, is tasked by God to install the first king. Somebody tell me over here who the first king of Israel was. Starts with an S. Saul, right? He installs Saul as the first king of Israel. 40 years later, David assumes the throne. 40 years after that, his son Solomon is the king of Israel. And they're established in this area around Jerusalem. They established the temple in Jerusalem, and things go pretty well. But lo and behold, if God was not right. And a couple of hundred years after that, 931 BC, the kingdom splits into two. Literally, they have what equates to a civil war in their kingdom. And it splits into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. A couple hundred years after that, the northern kingdom falls completely off the face of the map at the hands of the Assyrians. They are wiped out. They are no more. And it's in between this event and the next event in 586 BC when the southern kingdom of Judah is taken captive by the Babylonians that Habakkuk is tasked with his ministry from God. You see, in 538, this period of restoration begins. They're able to go back to their homeland. Ezra and Nehemiah lead them back, and they create this spiritual reform. And then the silent period starts about 400 BC, in between the Old and the New Testaments. And right around the turn of the calendar is when John the Baptist and Jesus enter on into the scene. And that's Israelite history in a very tiny nutshell. But Habakkuk is in between these two major events, the northern kingdom falling and the southern kingdom being taken captive. And you can imagine the task that Habakkuk has in front of him. Has anybody ever seen this movie before? Saving Private Ryan? Anybody seen that movie? It's a pretty good war movie. It's about World War II. And the bulk of the movie happens shortly after the storming of the beaches in Normandy. And Captain Miller, who's in the center there, played by Tom Hanks, is tasked with leading the 2nd Ranger Battalion on another mission. As soon as they get done storming the beaches, they're given another mission. And that mission is to literally go and save Private Ryan, hence the name of the movie. You see, Private Ryan has 3 brothers, and all 3 of his brothers have been killed in action during this war. And so their task given to them by command was to go and find Private Ryan and bring him back home because they don't want his mother to have to bury all of her children and their family line to completely stop there. Now you can imagine Captain Miller's platoon there being young and wanting some action and wanting to be able to kill the enemy are not too excited about this mission that they've been given. There's nothing exciting about it. It's not going to be fun. They're not going to be able to see the world. They have got to go and find one guy and bring him back. And there's a scene in that movie, I was going to show it to you, but I'll just describe it to you. There's a scene in that movie where they're walking through a field and Captain Miller's men are complaining to him. I mean, they're just like, I don't understand why we have to go do this. All these military resources, and we as a battalion unit have to go and find this one guy and bring him back. That seems like pretty small potatoes considering the world war that we're fighting at this time. And one of his men speaks up who's a little bit more respectful to his commands. And he says, Captain, I've got an opinion on this matter. And the Captain Miller goes, well, by all means, share it with the squad. And he says, the way that I see it, Captain, is this is a serious misallocation of military resources. Captain Miller's like, I like what I'm hearing so far. Go on, go on. And Private Jackson says, God gave me a gift. You see, he was the unit sniper, right? God gave me a gift. He made me a fine instrument of warfare. And if you put me and my sniper rifle with a clear line of sight up to a mile away from Adolf Hitler, pack your bags, we're going home because this war is going to be over. And Captain Miller looks at the rest of his men who have been complaining for miles and miles and miles, and he says, men, this is how you gripe. If you're going to complain about a task that you're given, this is how you do it. Respectfully, with honor. And then even when I tell you that we're not changing what we're doing, you say, yes, sir, and you go do it anyways. That is how you gripe. And that's kind of what we see here with Habakkuk. In his short 3 chapters, he brings 2 complaints to the ear of God. And his book is categorized as poems of lament, right? Sadness, worry, anxiety, complaining, if you will. And Habakkuk is unlike the other minor and major prophets. You see, Habakkuk doesn't speak to the people of Israel on behalf of God, as most of the rest of them did. Habakkuk doesn't accuse Israel of any sin. He doesn't give them any direction. But what he does do is address his personal struggles and concerns about the nation directly with God. And in the form of two complaints, he draws attention to the injustice and the suffering and the wickedness and the violence going on in the southern kingdom of Judah, and then he requests that God do something about it. And so we're going to look, first of all, at the first part of chapter 1, all of chapter 1 and the first part of chapter 2, because they're framed as kind of this back and forth between Habakkuk and God, much like Job has in an earlier book. And Habakkuk is going to lodge these two complaints, and then we're going to see God's response to these two complaints. So I want to read this first complaint here. And the first complaint is, God, why is the evil in Judah not being punished? And I think if you think about American culture in 2022, we can relate a lot to Habakkuk and what he sees around him. Sinfulness, selfishness, idolatry, materialism, wickedness and violence and division. That's what Habakkuk is staring at in the face, and I think we as Americans are looking at some of that today as well. Let's pick it up in chapter 1. We're going to read verses 2 through 4 and see Habakkuk's first official complaint to God. It says, "How long, O Lord, must I call for help, but you do not listen? Violence is everywhere I cry, but you do not come to save. Must I forever see these evil deeds? Why must I watch all this misery? Wherever I look, I see destruction and violence. I'm surrounded by people who love to argue and fight. The law has become paralyzed, and there's no justice in the courts. The wicked far outnumber the righteous, so that justice has become perverted." Sound familiar at all? You see, life in Israel, at least according to God's prophet Habakkuk, is miserable. It is horrible. The law is being neglected, there's violence, there's injustice, and all of it is being tolerated by Israel's corrupt leaders. You see, between the two kingdoms, there were a total of 38 kings, very few of which did what God wanted them to do, which is sad for the leader of God's chosen people. And Habakkuk is literally crying out to God for him to do something, because nothing ever seems to change. He wakes up one morning, violence, oppression, wickedness. Goes to sleep, wakes up the next morning, violence, oppression, wickedness, injustice. Over and over, day in and day out. And his request is simple. God, how long will you allow your glory to be trampled by your people? I can't bear it anymore. It's painful. It's miserable. It's embarrassing to me as a representative to you on behalf of these people. And in verses 5 through 11, we see God's first response. And just like his response in the conversation with Jonah, it's powerful. And it is effective, I think, as you can imagine having this conversation with God. I'll start in verse 5 and we'll read through verse 11. The Lord replied, "Look around at the nations. Look and be amazed. For I'm doing something in your own day, something you wouldn't believe even if someone told you about it. I'm raising up the Babylonians," or some of your versions may say Chaldeans, "a cruel and violent people. They will march across the world and conquer other lands. They are notorious for their cruelty and do whatever they like. Their horses are swifter than cheetahs and fiercer than wolves at dusk. Their charioteers charge from far away. Like eagles, they swoop down to devour their prey. On they come, all bent on violence. Their hordes advance like a desert wind, sweeping captives ahead of them like sand. They scoff at kings and princes and scorn all their fortresses. They simply pile ramps of earth against their walls and capture them. They sweep past like the wind and are gone. But they're deeply guilty, for their own strength is their God." God's response to Habakkuk in this first complaint is very simple. I'm aware. I understand your concern. I know exactly what's going on. Because think about it. As disgusted, Habakkuk, as you are, these are my people. I created them. I protected them. I brought care and concern for them. Everything they're doing is spitting in my face. Yeah, I know what's going on, Habakkuk. Don't worry. and I'm going to summon the armies of Babylon. Remember our timeline, what's going to come soon. And I'm going to use them to bring down my justice on the nation of Israel in the southern kingdom. Just you wait and see. Watch. I've got a bigger plan at play here. And then we see the second point that Habakkuk lodges, and I think logically, as human beings, this might be our next complaint. Okay, God, well, that makes perfect sense. But hold on just a second. Isn't Babylon worse than we are? They're more sinful, they're more wicked, more idolatry, more sexual immorality, more violence, more oppression, and you're going to use them to teach us a lesson, to teach us to become more godly and follow more closely your commands? That doesn't make any sense to me as a human being. He may be an inspired prophet, but he's still a human being. Wait, that doesn't make sense. So let's read verses 12 and 13. We'll see Habakkuk's second complaint, or at least the specific wording that he uses. O Lord my God, my Holy One, you who are eternal, surely you do not plan to wipe us out. O Lord, our rock, you have sent these Babylonians to correct us, to punish us for our many sins. But you are pure and cannot stand the sight of evil. Will you wink at their treachery? Should you be silent while the wicked swallow up people more righteous than they? Essentially, Habakkuk is saying, God, they devour people, and they do this for fun, nation upon nation upon nation, in order to build themselves up. Habakkuk just could not understand, and I can relate, how could such a good God use such corrupt people and nations as instruments to teach his own people, Israel, a lesson? Habakkuk requests an explanation from God. And you might be thinking like me right now, in the first couple of readings of this book, doing a study for this, much like the reaction I had when I saw Job's complaints to God. Wait a minute, Habakkuk. Who are you to question the creator of the universe, who holds you literally in his hand, along with your people, cares for you, provides for you, protects you, even admonishes you at times? Who are you to complain to God? But then I started thinking about it a little bit more. And it reminded me of a conversation that the teens and I had several months ago. I don't even remember what lesson I was teaching. I just remember the conversation we had back here in Bible class one day. We're talking about something similar to this, and one of the teens, or a couple of the teens, agreed with this statement. They said something like, if I ever questioned my parents, or had a concern for something that they wanted me to do, or needed some more clarification or understanding about what they expected of me, a couple of those teens did not feel like they were allowed to address their parents with some complaints or some concerns or a misunderstanding. And my next conversation with those teenagers were, look, I think, because I know your parents so well, that I can speak on their behalf, if you will do it respectfully, at the appropriate time, using the appropriate words when emotions are low, I feel quite confident that all of your parents would be happy to have a conversation with you about why they want you to do something a certain way, about something that they require of you, an expectation that they have on you. They would love to have that conversation in a calm, cool, and collected manner. And I feel quite certain that if my 5-year-old came to me with some concerns about what I was asking him to do, as long as he did it at an appropriate time, an appropriate place, and was respectful, I would love to have a conversation like that, because it allows you an opportunity to learn. Habakkuk is doing the exact same thing. God is not annoyed or mad that Habakkuk is bringing these complaints. He loves for his people to approach him respectfully with concerns or questions about what's going on in their life or the world around them. It is okay to ask God questions or present your concerns to him in a respectful way. I'll give you a perfect example of this in my own life. I've done this a couple of times recently. Some of you may know Megan and the boys and I live in Crandall in a neighborhood, and we love our house. We would just like a little bit more space, right? We like a quarter acre in a neighborhood. We love some acreage so that they can run and jump and play, and we don't have to worry about them running onto 148 and getting run over, right? So we've been looking for some property now for going on 4 years. And of course, we're very picky about where we want to go and where we want to move and what we want it to be like. But for whatever reason, maybe the market, maybe our pickiness, we have not been able to find something that suits our needs or where we feel like God is calling us to go. And there may be a good reason behind that, something we just don't understand at this current moment. And I'll admit, my prayer has been on several occasions, God, can you help me understand? We think this is what you're calling us to do. We think this would benefit our family. We think this would allow us to be able to use our property for your kingdom. But for whatever reason, you're not allowing us to have those opportunities. Why? Can you just help me understand? I want whatever you want, God. But can you just help me understand just a little bit why every door seems to close? God welcomes those conversations when they're done in a timely and respectful manner. And so let's look at the second response that God has to Habakkuk's second complaint of, wait a minute, Babylon's way worse than we are. How could you use them? Look at verses 2 through 4 of chapter 2. Chapter 2, verses 2 through 4, God's second response. Then the Lord said to me, write my answer plainly on tablets, so that a runner can carry the correct message to others. This vision is for a future time. It describes the end, and it will be fulfilled. If it seems slow in coming, wait patiently, for it will surely take place. It will not be delayed. Look at the proud. They trust in themselves, and their lives are crooked, but the righteous will live by their faithfulness to God. God literally tells Habakkuk to get out some tablets. Hey, brother, you might want to write this down. God is speaking. And he writes down a vision of an appointed time in the future. We know on the backside of this, he's writing about when the Babylonians come in and say, we're taking y'all. Sorry if you don't like it. We're taking you captive. And that happens very shortly after Habakkuk's ministry. And what God tells him is that violence and oppression create a never-ending cycle of revenge. And eventually, by the end, the righteous are going to live by their faith, and God will bring Babylon down. But not only Babylon, but other nations who use these tactics: sin and violence, wickedness and idolatry. This cycle is what God is going to use to bring about the rise and fall of nations. I mean, just think of examples like Russia and Ukraine and that skirmish. World War II, going back to our illustration from earlier, the Allied and the Axis powers, think of Rome, think of Greece. God uses nations, even corrupt, sinful, wicked nations, as tools in His larger plan. And it's important for us to note here, because I think sometimes we might have questions about this. The fact that God uses nations like Babylon for His will to bring about His justice does not mean He condones their behavior. He's using them to further His agenda in some way. And the agenda He's furthering in this case is the transformation of His people from wickedness and selfishness and sinfulness to devotion to God and His laws. And the second half of chapter 2, God just elaborates on some of these concerns that He has for these wicked nations. And He gives a list of 5 woes. And essentially, these are the things that nations like that are struggling with. Even you, Israel, are struggling with some of these things. Blackmail and stealing, the wealthy charging ridiculous interest rates, wealth building through corrupt and crooked means, slave labor, basically treating human beings like animals and threatening them with harm or death if they don't produce. alcohol abuse by national leaders, and people suffering while the leaders are partying. Idolatry, money and power and national security are turned into gods for these types of nations. And again, this is not just unique to Babylon. Do these 5 woes seem familiar at all in our current situation in America? And this is going to end up becoming God's answer to all generations of corrupt nations. Eventually, the righteous will live by their faith, and the wicked and the sinful will fall. And then in chapter 3, there's a beautiful prayer by God's prophet Habakkuk. And it starts in verse 2. Let's read verse 2 real quick. I've heard all about you, Lord. Essentially, okay, I just heard everything you told me. I'm filled with awe by your amazing works. In this time of your deep need, help us again as you did in years gone by, and in your anger, remember mercy. God just pulled the curtain back just a little bit to show Habakkuk what was to come. And Habakkuk says, Lord, that makes perfect sense. Remember your mercy and compassion and love for us when you dole out your punishment. I understand. I get it. I'm ready. And Habakkuk paints this beautiful picture as chapter 3 goes on, that when the Creator shows up to confront evil one day, everybody is going to be paying attention. And it reminds me of Exodus chapter 19 when Moses brings down the law from Mount Sinai, right? You've got the 10 Commandments, you've got the 613 other laws, and Israel gets a little bit of a glimpse of God. Not specific details of Him, but they see cloud and fire and smoke and earthquake, and they are just standing in awe. And that's what Habakkuk says will happen in the end. Everybody's going to pay attention when God shows up to confront evil. One day, God will bring about justice to all. He's going to destroy the wicked, and He's going to save the righteous. And on that day, everyone will be paying attention, whether they want to or not. And I want to read verses 16 through 19, literally the last 4 verses of the book. There's beautifully poetic conclusion with very hopeful praise about what is to come in Israel's future and the future of mankind. Starting in verse 16 and following of chapter 3. I remember inside when I heard this, my lips quivered with fear. My legs gave way beneath me, and I shook in terror. I will wait quietly for the coming day when disaster will strike the people who invade us. Even though the fig trees have no blossoms, there are no grapes on the vines, even though the olive crop fails, and the fields lie empty and barren, even though the flocks die in the fields and the cattle barns are empty, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will be joyful in the God of my salvation. The sovereign Lord is my strength. He makes me as sure-footed as a deer, able to tread upon the heights. Even if the world is falling apart, even if everything is painful and miserable and shameful and embarrassing, Habakkuk is going to choose to trust and put his joy in God. Now turn over to Psalm chapter 130. I want to read this real quick. Psalm chapter 130. And there's a beautiful psalm in here written about waiting on the Lord. You may not understand God's bigger picture, His bigger plan that's at play here. Just you wait. Listen to what the psalmist says. Psalm chapter 130. From the depths of despair, O Lord, I call for your help. Hear my cry, O Lord. Pay attention to my prayer. Lord, if you keep a record of our sins, who, O Lord, could ever survive? But you offer forgiveness that we might learn to fear you. I'm counting on the Lord. Yes, I'm counting. I'm waiting on Him. I've put my hope in his word. I long for the Lord more than the watchman waits for the dawn. Yes, more than the watchman waits for the dawn. O Israel, hope in the Lord. For with the Lord there is unfailing love. His redemption overflows. He himself will redeem Israel from every kind of sin. And so often when you flip through the book of Psalms, you think, oh, you read a little bit and you say, I know a worship song with that. Y'all have ever done that before? Several times I've read through the book of Psalms. There's a song like that. When we're reading through the Psalms right now at the breakfast table with my family, very often Graham will go, there's a song from that psalm, isn't there? There's actually a song from Psalm 130. And I want to play that psalm for us today. There's a great recording that Praise and Harmony does. And I'm going to scroll through the words on the screen. I want you to pay attention to the words. I want you to think about them as they apply to your own life. And if you feel so inclined, you can sing along with the Praise and Harmony team as they sing this song. So I want to go through this here and just listen to the words. It's one of my favorite songs lately to listen to when I just don't understand what's going on. Maybe things are going on that are painful, shameful, embarrassing. I see wickedness all around me. Maybe even I find myself falling into that as well. These are very good words of comfort out of Psalm 130. So the question is, what can we apply to our lives today? This is good stuff, good information, but now what do I do with it? Because information is not what we're looking for here. Transformation, as Mike always says, is what we're looking for. When we leave, what are we going to change, if anything? Well, we see that Habakkuk becomes a shining example of how the righteous live by faith, even when things are confusing, when you don't understand them, when they make no sense. Because imagine Habakkuk's situation, if you put it in big picture. Your kinfolk has literally just been decimated by the Assyrians. You're reading all the promises in the law and you're seeing none of them. The people that you call your own are ruining everything that God has built. There's not even a Messiah yet. In those moments, God desired and demanded faith from Habakkuk. You may not understand. Just wait. I've got a bigger picture at play here that you may not understand. So the next time that you're troubled, the next time you just don't get it, what God is trying to do in your life, make sure you bring your problem directly to Him, respectfully, as Habakkuk did. Believe and trust in God's wisdom, because I think we can all agree His wisdom far outshines our own. Trust Him. Be encouraged. Move from doubt to faith, as Habakkuk did. He had doubts. God answered. He moved into faith. And most importantly, we've got to realize that the problem is never with God. Habakkuk's original complaint was, God, what are you doing? Are you paying attention? God says, yeah, I'm paying attention. Don't you worry. Watch and wait. And if I had to boil this lesson down to one point for you to remember, I'd want you to remember this. As Christians, we are called to trust God even when life seems impossible or doesn't make any sense. Especially when life seems impossible or doesn't make any sense. Anybody ever gone through something in their lives that seemed impossible and didn't make any sense? It's at that time that God is requiring faith. He has a bigger plan at play. I hope you were encouraged by the message tonight. We're going to sing a song of encouragement here in a minute. If you've got a question or a concern or a prayer request or just need a shoulder to cry on, we're going to extend the invitation to you this evening. I pray that you come and stand as we sing this song of invitation.